I'm so delighted to introduce our wonderful guest expert, Dr. Rebecca Huntley. Rebecca is one of Australia's foremost researchers on social trends, and with degrees in law and film studies and a PhD in gender studies. She has led research at Essential Media and Vox Populi and was a director at Ipsos Australia. For several years, she ran her own research and consultancy firm, working closely with climate and environment NGOs, government and business on climate change strategy and communication. And she's now Director of Research at the agency 89 Degrees East. In collaboration with Plan International Australia, Rebecca has been the driving force behind the Gender Compass, a groundbreaking research project segmenting the Australian public into 6 groups according to their beliefs, policy preferences and behaviours regarding gender equality. The Trewella Foundation and the Women's Leadership Institute of Australia are proud funders and partners because we see this as such critical work. Firstly, because language and narratives matter. Secondly, because the approach is deeply pragmatic. It's about equipping people and organisations with tools for change. And finally, it has applicability across all sectors. So I'm really hoping that this will spark your thinking. There are such useful insights that can be utilised across a range of political areas, especially in campaigning and policy development. So over to you, Rebecca. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks so much to Pathways to invite me to share this with you. I was particularly thrilled because I've been passionately focused and supportive of more women in politics across the political spectrum, and I think that the Gender Compass is very useful for particularly for women leaders who are looking at ways to talk about gender equality across the community, because you'll turn up to a lot of events, community events, where you won't really often have a good sense of who's in the audience. So a lot of this research and the tools that come off this research, including our messaging guide, will be particularly useful for you. There is Champions of Change also have an AI tool that is helpful. So I'll be talking a bit about that after I introduce the research to you. So if somebody can share the presentation, I can start. I promise you I don't have many slides because we do have to finish it at 10:30 on time. So here's a bit of background about the Gender Compass. As Sarah said, this is funded by Plan International. Well, it's funded by Plan International, and I was the supervising researcher on both waves of the work, and funded broadly by philanthropy. What is a compass? Well, a compass is at heart an audience segmentation. So it divides the community based on their attitudes to a particular issue. And once we have those personas, as you can see up there, and I'll go through who they are in a minute, you'll also know a bit more about a range of things, the demographic profile of that persona, where they are likely to vote. So they're likely to be a progressive voter or a centre voter or a swinging voter, and a range of other things, including where those personas get their media and information from, and where they're able to be persuaded, and what might be some of the barriers for persuasion, barriers for action. So when we do this kind of work very quickly from a methodological point of view, we want to make sure that there isn't work out there like that. So we do a very extensive literature scan to get a sense of whether there's anything else like that, and there wasn't. We also want to understand, and we consulted very widely across the sector to see if something like this would be useful. And in both wave 1, which was the quantitative part of it, where we determined the segments, and wave 2, where we dived really deeply into the messaging and communication preferences of the different segments, we really wanted to make something that was a very kind of intuitive tool, and as Sarah said, very pragmatic, measured where people are right now, and potentially how you could talk to them about gender equality and about the policies involved in gender equality. And so very much something that you can take it and run with it. The next slide will tell you a bit about who those segments are. Right, so if you have more questions, which I'm sure you do whenever I present this work, there's it raises more questions than it answers. On the Plan International website, there is an extensive report about the segmentation which gives you two-page profiles on each of the segments, which tells you a lot about not just their attitudes, but who they are. And then also on the Plan International website, there is the messaging guide. So how do you talk to what we describe as the movable middle on gender equality? But let me give you a whistle-stop tour of who these segments are. I would like to start with the Trailblazers, not because I'm in that segment, or assume a lot of you are, but it's useful to kind of measure just how many Australians and who they are really would be on the same wavelength as we are about gender equality right now. So it's at 19%. That Trailblazer group absolutely see gender equality as a priority for themselves personally, but also should be a high priority for government and for policy. They're probably the only segment that recognise that we are a long way from achieving gender equality, and their emotional response to that is one of frustration and anger. They tend to trend towards younger women, more educated women, but there are men and there are people across the age groups in that Trailblazer segment. Every segmentation has a kind of a segment that see this as incredibly important, and some people would describe that as the base. I would say the base is a combination of the Trailblazer and hopeful. But it is useful to know that that's really only about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 Australians would be in that Trailblazer group. And like I said, the Trailblazers are distinguished by many things, but one of the things that distinguish most is that they recognise, gender equality is not something that we've achieved or about to achieve anytime soon. Going anti-clockwise to the left, we go to the hopeful segment, and together the Trailblazers and the hopefuls would probably make up what we would say as our base. They don't need persuading. More importantly, they need to be mobilised to do more and also be equipped with information about how to talk about gender equality more broadly across the other segments. That hopeful segment is larger than the Trailblazer segment, and they agree with the Trailblazers on a lot of things, although they're less pessimistic and much more likely to agree that there has been, reasonably steady and important change and some optimism, and probably less frustrated and annoyed than the Trailblazers. There's lots of reasons why that's the case. I think one of the things that I will pull out is the hopefuls tend to be older. Older men and women in that group tend to be a bit more slightly different. Their political orientation is slightly different. But in the qualitative research we did for the second phase with the hopeful group, what was really clear is though they lived experience with gender equality was that they had seen quite a lot change in their lifetime. So if you're a woman in your 60s and 70s, you remember a time where women had to get a man to co-sign their, mortgage or application for a credit card. So because they've kind of seen so much change, they're kind of a bit more optimistic about where we're at. They also tend to there's quite a lot demographically which kind of give them a slightly different mindset than the Trailblazers. But together the hopeful and the Trailblazers kind of create a kind of, I would say, somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population where you can talk to about gender equality. The question is, what are the barriers to further action for them? Then the rest of the segments are really interesting and really speak to the political and social moment that we're in right now and the information environment that we're in right now. The moderate segment are interesting, almost 1 in 4 Australians, and demographically they tend to mirror the kind of all the averages of, so it's split between men and women pretty roughly, and, in terms of all those other demographics, pretty representative of the broader Australian population. The moderates are people who would say they have a balanced view about gender equality. So when you put a lot of statements about gender equality in front of them, there's a reasonable level of agreement. But the challenge with that group is that they think that gender equality has largely been addressed, and they don't see it as particularly salient, either personally or they don't necessarily think that it should be a high priority for government. So this is a group where it is actually kind of can be hard to engage them on gender equality. There's a lot of other issues competing for their attention. And they really struggle to necessarily connect improvements in policy around gender equality with personal benefit. So there's a salience issue with them rather than they're resisting gender equality or a backlash issue. And then we have some really interesting segments. We start to see here, you know, where the community can be quite polarised on a complex issue like gender equality at this moment. Let me talk about that in a different segment. It's quite small. We haven't spent a lot of time in the work that we've done on Gender Compass focusing on that group. That indifferent segment is pretty much shows up in a lot of the segmentations I do. It's around the same size as the one in the Climate Compass work that I do. They're not so much indifferent to gender equality as indifferent to any political issue and complex political issue or politics more broadly. So, you know, we don't tend to focus on them as much as these two other segments, which to me, like I said, really speak to the moment that we're in right now. That conflicted segment at 12%, again, quite small, like smaller than the Trailblazers group. Why are they conflicted? Because on the one hand, they'll agree quite strongly with some statements around gender equality, like we all benefit from a gender equal society. But on the other hand, when you're asking questions like, you know, the pendulum has swung, you know, towards more discrimination against men, or some quite, they seem to have what are potentially contradictory attitudes to gender equality. It may be. So there's a kind of like an internal push and pull in them around gender equality. Demographically, they're very interesting. They tend to skew to younger, so under 40, with families, university educated, living in cities. And then the only segment where culturally and linguistically diverse participants over-index. So I don't want to emphasise that too much, but I think it's a really interesting conversation being had amongst young workers, young parents, university educated in cities, in the workplace around gender equality more broadly. And it's an evolving conversation, which is why it's a very interesting segment and one that can't necessarily be ignored. One final point about the rejector segment at 17%. Why are they rejectors? So they're different than some of these other segments that perhaps don't think gender equality is relevant, or perhaps are a bit torn about how they feel about it. This group is kind of adamant that gender equality is, they're adamant that there is a war against men, and that gender equality hasn't just been achieved for women. We're now in a position where it's been we've overshot the mark, and really it's young men and boys that are in trouble. And there is a lot in that rejector segment, and worth having a look at who they are. As a point of contrast, so in every segmentation there's always a version of Trailblazers and rejectors, and a whole heap of segments in the middle. This is kind of twice the size of any other rejector segment, and rejector segments are generally quite active, like they're not passive like moderate segments. They're angry. They're as angry as the Trailblazers, but in a different way with different views. So the size of that segment, when we discovered this about, you know, when we first cut the data a few years ago, was like, oh, that's a bit bigger than I thought. And also internally, because a segment of that size is going to have much more internal diversity, like across the community, than, let's say, a smaller segment. So there is a reasonable percentage within that segment who are coming from younger age groups, and there are obviously women in that group as well. So we went back to just make sure that the data was right, and then, of course, checked it against other robust data sets here and overseas who are finding a similar kind of, this is where the backlash is that's so now talked about so much in the last couple of years, and is seen as, you know, in a sense, present in a whole range of not just social research, but potentially also electoral contests like in the US. And if you're interested, I can share with you some comparisons that our data scientist has done with potentially voting patterns of young men in the United States versus potentially what might show up here, although it didn't show up in the last election, which was interesting for a whole range of reasons. the size of that rejector segment and the internal diversity of it, i.e. that rejector segment isn't just going to get smaller over time because it's made up entirely of older men over 60, was a bit of a kind of, really kind of clear sign that there was that the backlash that we're seeing, particularly online, but not exclusively online, was having an impact, having an effect. So in this way, the gender compass is quite different than the climate compass and some other segmentations I've done. So quite challenging there. I will say one thing about compasses and generally is that often when I present them to people, their immediate question can be, how do we make everybody trailblazers, or how do we make everybody hopeful? Like, how do we push everybody, the moderates and the conflicteds, all the rest of it, into these segments? So you have to very modest ambitions when it comes to shifting segments. So much goes into attitudinal and contextual and socioeconomic go into driving you into a particular segment. And actually segments don't change much over time. In fact, they might only fluctuate beyond the margin of error 1 or 2% over 5 or 6 years, unless dramatic things happen to shift them. There are certain kind of demographic changes that can push them, but that's not the case with the gender compass. What's clear is that some of those young men in the rejector segment may stay in the rejector segment as time goes on. And so we often say with the compass, how do you take this is where the community sit and will sit for some time, and how do you work out how to talk about gender equality specifically in a way that connects with these segments and might move them on attitudinal and behavioural issues in a way that might not necessarily throw them into another segment. And so that's a little bit about how to use it and potentially the approach to take to it. We might move to the next slide to tell you a little bit about some top line. You can all read and we're all up there, so I don't feel like I'm just going to pull out cherry pick some kind of issue, some kind of key points from these slides, and then tell you a little bit about where you can go to work out, how you might use it. That tells you a little bit about the second wave of the work that we did. The first wave sample was close to 3,000, and this next wave was over 2,000. So we could segment them to see how they responded to certain messages around gender equality, as well as certain attitudes to policy and settings in which gender equality should be talked about. So overall, separate from the segmentation, there's a lot of good news in this. The most care about gender equality, value treating people fairly, and more importantly, and this is a theme throughout all the work, believe that our society benefits from being a gender equal society. If you move to the next, so that's all good news. The devil is always in the detail, as they say. It's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. If you look at the next slide. The challenge is that you can see most of those segments think that this has largely been addressed. It's only really the trailblazers and to some extent the hopefuls think that, no, we've got a way to go. So a lot of people think, oh, we're already there yet. We're already there now. And that means that potentially they can see some policies and ideas as unnecessary and potentially having detrimental effects if we're already have achieved gender equality. So that is a challenge. I think also I would say that the counter narratives are also resonating, not beyond just obviously in that rejector category, but actually in some ways throughout all the segments there was a bit of like, oh, perhaps men are under attack and perhaps boys are being under-serviced in schools. So there's a bit of that counter narrative is also resonating very strongly. Almost 1 in 2 of that 2,000 found the opposition message that we gave to stop blaming men very convincing. And that was also something that came through in the women's groups, in the hopeful, all of the segments except for the trailblazer women, but it certainly came through in the trailblazer men, is that they felt that some of the challenges of talking about gender equality is there's perception amongst their fellow men that they were being blamed for things that weren't their fault. And this is always very challenging, of course, for us because, there's so much that challenges us when we think about those kinds of questions, and so much in the gender compass that is challenging. If we go to the next slide, you'll see here that, and this was one of the most important things that came out of the second wave of the work, other than the message testing, which is all pretty much encapsulated in the messaging guide, is I thought there would be more of a backlash to people saying we shouldn't really be talking about things like respectful relationships across a range of settings, whether that be schools or workplaces. But not the case. In fact, when we asked, it's not here, but when we asked, if your workplace or your school or your faith setting or your sporting organisation said, let's have a conversation about respectful relationships, I thought there'd be far more people who were kind of bored or frustrated or angry about that. Not the case. The strong majority of people either feeling neutral or hopeful, proud, safe and enthusiastic. So what I take from that is there is an appetite to have this conversation across a range of settings, including work and education settings. The question is, how do we have it in a way that addresses some key issues? The idea that we haven't achieved gender equality, the idea that gender equality should be a shared project with a place and a role for girls and women, men and boys, and, how do we do this in a way where we all benefit. We have a lot in the messaging guide about how to have an effective conversation, given there's a permission to have it across settings, but I'll leave you to access that work. It would be very useful for you. And on the next slide, you'll see some of the tools that you can use off the back of the Gender Compass that will help you translate it to the work that you want. At the moment, the Gender Compass is being used by a range of organisations. It's embedded in the work that Respect Victoria does. Like I said, Champions of Change have developed a fabulous AI tool with the Gender Compass, as well as some other important tools embedded in that. And you can have a look online for a lot of information, not just the moving the middle messaging guide, but a lot of deep information about all of these segments. In the new year, we'll also be releasing a podcast which will have a range of different leaders across the gender equality space. We'll be talking about how they're using Gender Compass in their internal communications, their external communications, how they fund, how they work, and that will also give you a bit of insight and perhaps some inspiration about how to use Gender Compass in your own work. And finally, what I would say in relation to all the work that you're doing is that, look, we know that women, particularly women in public life and in politics who step into the public sphere are almost always, and particularly women from diverse backgrounds or from First Nations backgrounds, when they step into the public domain to talk about complex issues, whether it be gender equality, climate, social justice issues, they get a raft of horrible stuff directed in their direction, as we saw with a million examples of this. We saw this in New South Wales just a couple of weeks ago with some women politicians across the divide speaking out against that Nazi protest and getting a real barrage of horrible things in their direction. And certainly we are in a difficult and polarised environment. And like I said, that rejected category being quite a large one. But that I would say that even though it's 17%, 17% is still a small minority. It's a minority. It's a very, in some ways, well-resourced and damaging, an activated, damaging minority. But I really believe the majority of people are either on our side around gender equality or could be one with the right approaches and the right and renewed and refreshed communications. And also we are, as much as the global, as much as the kind of very worrying clouds across the globe around gender equality continue to gather, we are a bit luckier than most in that we've got a relatively stable, at the least the federal level, policy environment, some opportunities to get some real runs on the board in terms of how a more gender equal society can actually benefit us all. So we have this kind of golden opportunity, and particularly you do, as political leaders, as leaders in policy, communicating about these issues, to talk about that idea of shared benefit. And really, the Gender Compass couldn't have arrived at a better time as a kind of practical tool to give you some guidance about, okay, in this kind of environment, how can I talk about it in a way that could at least reach some of those moderate, conflicted and hopeful people? And there's nothing much I can do right now about that rejected group, but potentially try and hold that middle group. And the messaging guide gives you some really clear directions and some certainty that the way you might be proceeding has actually been researched and has a bit of an evidence base, and may in fact already align with the way you're talking about these issues, in which case it's a reinforcement that you're doing the right thing. So thank you so much for your time. I hope this is very useful. If you've got any specific questions about the work, I know we don't have any time for questions today, then please feel free to reach out to the fantastic Pathways team. They know my phone number and my email, so they can contact me.
Rebecca, thank you so much. I'm really pleased that we've had this session, and Erin's going to put in the chat a link to all of these different documents. Really encourage you to spend some time looking at the messaging guide. It's very practical. It gives you examples of how you might want to adapt the language you use to engage more broadly across these different segments. As Rebecca mentioned, we're Women's Leadership Institute are actually partnering with Champions of Change on that AI prompt tool, so we'll certainly be sharing that. Again, it's a really helpful way to look at how you might adapt communications or through to strategy and policy development, leveraging this really evidence-based work. So as always, so appreciate your insights, Rebecca, and if you start using it and find it's helpful, please do share that back, because this phase is all about how we can learn together and what are the best, most practical ways that we can be implementing Gender Compass. So thanks everyone, and have a great week.